Hello again, Pastor Andrew here with another installment of our devotionals through the attributes of God. And this week we're talking about God's will and what that looks like. Ephesians chapter 1 verse 11 is kind of the umbrella passage under which we're talking about these things this week. And that says that all things happen according to the counsel of God's will. And last night we talked about what that looks like in our day-to-day lives. And I want to zero in on that tonight with thinking about how that relates to suffering. And we do not like to think of suffering as something that God would will into our lives, but the scriptures are quite clear that He does. I'll just give you two examples, both of them from the book of 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 17 says, "For it is better to suffer for doing right, if that should be God's will, than for doing wrong." And so the assumption there is that our suffering is something that we should endure because there are times when God wills that to be the case. And we skip over to the next chapter, chapter 4, verse 19. "Therefore let those who suffer according to God's will do right and entrust their souls to a faithful Creator." Now, there is an objection I have heard in many cases from people that a good God would not allow His children to endure such pain and such suffering, and I think that that's a little bit short-sighted, because I think the assumption there is that suffering and pain are fundamentally bad things. Now, the experience of them may be bad, but God has more in mind than simply the temporary experience of pain. We know from this life that there are very few things that are worth anything that did not require some level of pain for us to achieve it. I play the guitar, not well, but I play the guitar. And I remember whenever I was 7 years old when I first started to learn how to play. And I would lie in bed at night, and I would lay my guitar beside me, and I would hold my fingers down on the strings so as to develop calluses on my fingers, because the pain of trying to finger the chords was so intense. It was almost agonizing at times. And so I wanted to develop those calluses in my fingers so that I could play the guitar without the pain. And so I subjected myself to pain in order to achieve a level of being able to learn to play the guitar. And then beyond that, I had to subject myself to routines and learning how to stretch my fingers in certain ways and all of this. And it took years to do this. Now that's a minor example, but it's an example of a level of pain that was required for us to do this. I have an education. You go through 12 years of 13 years, including kindergarten, of primary school. Many of us have college education or beyond. And we subject ourselves to levels of pain in order to achieve an education that advances us in this world. If you work out, you exercise. I ran today, and my legs are hurting right now. And I do that not because of the benefit of pain, but because of the benefit that the pain yields in time, that I'll have a good heart, that I'll have good lungs, that I'll have good general health. These are all examples from just normal day-to-day life. The fact is that in character formation, in spiritual formation, nothing is of more value than pain and suffering. Now, it's also a danger because sometimes we can allow that pain and suffering to derail our faith. But if we allow it to move us more deeply into leaning into God and trusting in Him, well, the potential is quite great. C.S. Lewis once famously said that God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks to us in our consciences, and shouts to us in our pain. That suffering and pain is His megaphone for a deaf world. And we can look back in the course of our lives and realize that the times in which we grew the most were not the times of great pleasantness. They were the times of suffering and pain. Those were the times when we were formed and changed. It's interesting, I heard somebody say once that as parents, often we want to spare our children as much as possible from experiencing any level of pain. And yet, it is pain itself and suffering that is necessary for forming the type of children that we wish to have. And kind of a bit of a paradox in terms of parenting. My point being, suffering is necessary to develop the type of character that God wishes us to have, and indeed we wish to have. So God wills it. God allows it into our lives to form us, to change us, and to accomplish other ends that He alone may very well know. And there's a couple other passages I just wish to bring to your mind to close this out today. The Apostle Paul, in both cases, talking here. In Philippians chapter 4, verse 3, Paul writes these words. He says that he, in verse 10, that I may know Him and the power of His resurrection, and may share His sufferings, becoming like Him in His death, that by any means possible I may attain the resurrection from the dead. You see, Paul sees both as important components of God's development of His own life. The experience of power of Jesus' resurrection, that there's maybe you could say those mountaintop experiences in your spiritual life, but also the depth of pain, that fellowship in the sufferings of Jesus, that walking the Calvary road to the cross with Christ, that too is necessary. And James would later say we should rejoice in such sufferings, because these sufferings, if we do it with Christ, produce in us, as Paul would say in Corinthians, an eternal weight of glory. These things are important for God informing us. One last example here, Romans chapter 8, verse 17. Paul writes these words, and if that we are children of God, and if children, that we're heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ. But listen to this contingency that Paul puts here. Provided we suffer with Him, in order that we may also be glorified with Him. So in essence, I want to say to you that God wills our sufferings at times, and it's not because He hates us, or He's malevolent, or He gets a big kick out of it. It's actually because He loves us. It's because that He wishes to form us into the image of Jesus Christ, and the only means for doing that is to whittle away at the soft exterior of who we are, to get to the real core of us, to hollow us out so that more of Him can fit inside of us. And so do not begrudge it, but lean into Him. If you find yourself in a season when God has willed that you should suffer, understand that your God is in control of this, and it is for your good that He is doing it. God bless. Have a good night.